The sky above North Africa shimmers with heat, even at altitude. It's February 1943, and the air war over the Mediterranean theater has reached a savage intensity. American B-17 flying fortresses, those four-engine behemoths of aluminum and steel, have been pounding German-held positions with relentless determination. Today is no different, except that today, one crew aboard a bomber named All-American will experience something that defies every principle of aerodynamics, every assumption about structural integrity, and every calculation of survival. Picture this scene. A formation of B-17s, having just completed their bombing run over the docks at Tunis, turns for home. The crews are tense but relieved. The flak has been intense, but they've made it through the worst. Or so they think. Because in the next few moments, something will happen that will create one of the most iconic photographs of World War II, an image so shocking that even today, 7 decades later, it's difficult to believe the aircraft in that picture managed to fly at all. The date is February 1st, 1943. The place is Tunisia, North Africa. The crew is from the 414th Bomb Squadron, 97th Bomb Group. And what happens to them will become the stuff of legend, a story that will be told and retold, sometimes accurately, sometimes embellished, but always with a sense of wonder at what human determination and engineering excellence can achieve when pushed to the absolute limit. Before we dive into the heart of this remarkable story, we need to understand the world these men inhabited. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American industrial might, a testament to what mass production and engineering ingenuity could create. Weighing approximately 36,000 pounds empty and capable of carrying up to 65,000 pounds fully loaded, the B-17 was a massive machine for its time. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, propelled this metal giant through the skies at speeds reaching 300 miles per hour at altitude. But numbers don't tell the whole story. What made the B-17 legendary wasn't just its specifications, it was its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Bomber crews developed an almost mystical faith in the Flying Fortress. They'd seen B-17s return to base with engines shot out, with gaping holes in the fuselage, with tail sections barely attached. The aircraft seemed indestructible. And in early 1943, crews needed that reassurance, because the odds they faced were absolutely terrifying. Let's talk about those odds for a moment, because understanding them is crucial to appreciating what the crew of All-American accomplished. In early 1943, the statistical reality for American bomber crews was brutal. By the end of that year, only about 25% of 8th Air Force personnel would survive completing 25 missions. 25%. That means 3 out of every 4 men who climbed into a bomber would be killed, severely wounded, or captured as prisoners of war before they could finish their tour. Some bomb groups faced even worse odds. The 100th Bomb Group, which would become known as the Bloody 100th, lost 732 airmen and 177 aircraft in just 22 months of combat. Only 4 of the group's original 38 pilots completed their 25 mission tours. That's a 10% survival rate. These weren't abstract statistics to the men who flew. Every morning at bases across England and North Africa, crews would gather for briefings. They'd learn their target for the day. They'd see the red line on the map showing their route deep into enemy territory. And they'd do the math in their heads, calculating their chances, wondering if this would be the mission they didn't come back from. Then they'd climb into their bombers anyway, because that's what they'd signed up to do, and because someone had to strike back at the Nazi war machine. The crew of All-American was no different from thousands of other American airmen. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, thrust into a war that required them to fly into skies filled with exploding flak and enemy fighters determined to shoot them down. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, had the weight of 10 lives on his shoulders every time he took off. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, sat beside him, ready to take over if Bragg was wounded or killed. Behind them, 8 other crew members manned their stations, each one vital to the aircraft's survival and mission success. These positions weren't ceremonial. The bombardier in the nose had the responsibility of actually delivering the bombs to target. The navigator plotted their course through enemy territory and back. The radio operator maintained communication with the squadron and with base. And then there were the gunners stationed in the ball turret underneath the aircraft, the top turret, the waist positions, and the tail. These men faced the enemy fighters directly, their .50 caliber machine guns the only thing standing between the bomber and the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that swarmed the formations. On February 1st, 1943, All-American took off from its base near Biskra, Algeria, as part of a larger formation targeting the German-controlled seaports at Bizerte and Tunis. The mission profile was straightforward. Fly to the target, release the bomb load, return to base. Simple on paper, anything but simple in execution. The distance from Biskra to Tunis was roughly 300 miles, close by American standards, but still 300 miles of hostile territory where anything could happen. The bombers climbed to altitude, forming up into their combat box formations. This wasn't just for show. The combat box was a defensive tactic born from bitter experience, by flying in tight formation. With each bomber's guns covering the blind spots of the others, the Americans created a wall of firepower that gave German fighters pause. Attack a single straggler, and you might shoot it down relatively easily. Attack a tight formation, and you'd face dozens of .50 caliber machine guns, all firing at once. Many German fighter pilots learned this lesson the hard way and didn't survive the education. All-American slotted into its position in the formation. On this particular mission, one of the scheduled aircraft had developed engine trouble before takeoff. All-American, designated as a spare, moved up to take its place. It's one of those small twists of fate that seem insignificant at the time. If that other bomber hadn't had mechanical issues, All-American wouldn't have flown that day. The crew's story would have been entirely different, but that's how war works. 1,000 small decisions and accidents combining to determine who lives and who dies. The formation droned southward through the clear North African sky. At altitude, the temperature outside the aircraft plunged to 50 or 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The crew wore heavy leather jackets lined with wool, thick gloves, and heated flight suits. Even with all that insulation, the cold was brutal. Frostbite was a constant threat. Men had lost fingers and toes to the freezing temperatures at bombing altitude. It was just one more hazard in an already hazardous occupation. As they approached the target area, the crews went through their final preparations. The bombardier armed the bombs. The gunners scanned the sky for enemy fighters. The pilot maintained formation, keeping All-American locked into position with the other bombers. And then they were over the target, and the flak started. Anti-aircraft flak was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of bombing missions. You couldn't fight back against it, you couldn't outmaneuver it. All you could do was fly straight and level through it, maintaining formation while the sky around you exploded into black puffs of shrapnel-filled smoke. Each burst represented a shell that had climbed miles into the sky before exploding, sending metal fragments in every direction. If you were lucky, the flak burst near you, but not on you. If you were unlucky, shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, through electrical systems, through engines, through human flesh. The bombardiers released their payloads. Thousands of pounds of high explosive tumbled down toward the docks below. For a few seconds, the crews could see the bombs falling, and then they were lost in the haze. The bombers began their turn, breaking away from the target area, heading back toward friendly territory. This was the moment when crews started to relax just slightly. The worst part was over. They'd survived the flak over the target. Now they just had to get home. That's when the German fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe had learned that the best time to hit American bombers was on the return leg, when the formation sometimes loosened up, when crews let their guard down slightly, when aircraft damaged by flak became stragglers vulnerable to attack. The German pilots were skilled and experienced, many of them veterans of years of combat. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to position their aircraft for maximum effect. 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters dove on the formation. One targeted the lead bomber. The other went for All-American. The bomber's gunners opened fire immediately, their .50 caliber machine guns hammering out rounds. Tracers laced through the air. The first German fighter went down, torn apart by the concentrated defensive fire. One victory for the Americans. But the second fighter pressed his attack, coming in from head-on, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. What happened next occurred in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds would stretch out. Across the decades in memory and photograph, the German fighter, either hit by defensive fire or piloted by a wounded or dying airman, didn't pull up from its attack run. Instead, it continued directly into the bomber's flight path. In the cockpit of All-American, Lieutenant Bragg saw the fighter coming, saw that there was no time for evasive action, no time for anything except instinct. "I rammed the controls forward in a violent attempt to avoid collision," Bragg would later recall. "I flinched as the fighter passed inches over my head, and then I felt a slight thud like a coughing engine." That slight thud was actually a Messerschmitt Bf 109 slamming into the rear fuselage of the B-17 at closing speeds that exceeded 500 miles per hour. The fighter literally disintegrated on impact, its structure no match for the collision forces. But in that fraction of a second, before it broke apart completely, the Bf 109's wing sliced through the B-17's fuselage like a massive blade. Metal screamed, aluminum tore. The structural integrity of the bomber, designed to withstand flak and machine gun fire, was pushed far beyond anything the engineers at Boeing had ever imagined. In the cockpit, Bragg immediately knew something catastrophic had happened. The trim tabs weren't working. The aircraft wanted to climb, and only by applying constant pressure to the controls could he keep it level. He throttled back the engines, discovering that by reducing power, he could maintain something approaching controlled flight. But he had no idea of the true extent of the damage. He couldn't see the rear fuselage from the pilot's seat. He didn't know that he was essentially flying 2 separate pieces of aircraft that were connected by little more than willpower and a few fragments of structure. Let's describe that damage in detail because it's important to understand just how impossible it was that All-American continued flying. The German fighter's wing had nearly severed the bomber's fuselage completely. The cut went almost all the way through the aircraft's body, leaving only 2 small sections of frame and a narrow strip of metal skin holding the tail section to the rest of the bomber. Think about that for a moment. Imagine taking a knife and cutting almost all the way through a tube, leaving just a tiny bit of material connecting the 2 halves. Now imagine that tube is flying through the air at hundreds of miles per hour, with wind forces trying to rip it apart. That's what All-American had become. The left horizontal stabilizer, one of the smaller wings on the tail that helps control the aircraft's pitch, was completely gone. The left elevator, the movable surface on that stabilizer, was torn away with it. The vertical fin and rudder, the tail surfaces that control the aircraft's direction, were severely damaged. There was a hole in the fuselage over 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its widest point. The split in the fuselage extended all the way to the top of the upper gun turret. Looking at the aircraft from the side, you could see daylight through the plane where solid structure should have been. Inside the bomber, the crew faced a nightmare scenario. The radios were damaged. The oxygen system was compromised. The electrical system was malfunctioning. 2 of the 4 engines on the right side were out completely, and a third engine had developed a serious oil leak. The aircraft was flying, yes, but it was flying in a way that seemed to violate every principle of aeronautics. The tail section was wobbling and twisting. With every movement of the control surfaces, the entire back of the aircraft flexed in ways that made it seem like it would tear free at any moment. The tail gunner, isolated in his position at the very back of the aircraft, found himself in a surreal situation. There was no floor connecting his section to the rest of the bomber. He could look forward and see the main fuselage through a gap that should not exist. If the tail broke off, he would go down with it, because there was no way for him to climb back to the main section of the aircraft. His weight, it turned out, was actually helping to stabilize the tail section. The gunners in the waist position, just forward of the severed section, could see the damage clearly. They could see the tail section moving independently, see the metal skin rippling, see pieces of the German fighter's wreckage still embedded in the bomber's structure. There was a moment, probably just a few seconds but feeling like an eternity, when the crew had to make a decision. Should they bail out? Should they take their chances with parachutes over enemy territory? Or should they stay with the aircraft and trust their pilot to somehow get them home? The temptation to jump must have been overwhelming. They could see the damage. They knew how impossible it was for the aircraft to stay together. Every second they remained aboard was a second closer to catastrophic structural failure. But they didn't bail out. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was trust in Lieutenant Bragg. Maybe it was the knowledge that bailing out over enemy territory meant capture at best, death at worst. Or maybe it was simply the bomber crewman's code. You don't abandon your aircraft if there's any chance of saving it. Whatever the reason, the crew stayed at their stations, and Lieutenant Bragg kept flying. The rest of the formation stayed with them. This was crucial. In the combat box formation, bombers protected each other. If all American had been alone, German fighters would have swarmed it like sharks sensing wounded prey. But the other bombers maintained position, their guns ready to engage any enemy aircraft that tried to finish off the damaged B-17. It was a brotherhood forged in combat, a mutual understanding that every crew would do the same for any other. As they flew, the crew worked frantically to stabilize the aircraft. This is where some of the mythology around All-American has grown over the years, and it's important to separate fact from embellishment. Early accounts claim that the crew used their parachute harnesses to tie the fuselage together and that they scavenged parts from the German fighter wreckage to reinforce the structure. It makes for a dramatic story, and it was widely reported for decades. But more recent interviews with actual crew members have revealed a different picture. The crew did don their parachutes, wearing them throughout the flight in case they needed to bail out. But they didn't dismantle them to create makeshift structural supports. The physics simply wouldn't have worked. Parachute cords couldn't possibly hold together a multi-ton aircraft under the stress of flight. What they did do was even more impressive in its own way. They maintained discipline. They stayed at their positions. The gunners kept watch for enemy fighters. The pilot and co-pilot worked together to fly an aircraft that responded unpredictably to every control input. The navigator plotted the course home, making sure they didn't stray over heavily defended areas. The radio operator, working with damaged equipment, tried to maintain communication. Every crew member understood that their survival depended on everyone doing their job perfectly, with no margin for error. P-51 Mustang fighters eventually caught up with the formation. These long-range escort fighters had been increasingly available to protect bomber formations as 1943 progressed, and their presence had already started to change the equation of the air war. The P-51 pilots were stunned by what they saw. They flew close to All-American, close enough to see the catastrophic damage, close enough to see the tail section moving independently from the rest of the aircraft. They radioed ahead to the base, describing what they were seeing, but adding that they didn't think the bomber would make it to land. Their assessment was entirely reasonable. Any aircraft that damaged should not still be flying. Lieutenant Bragg, unable to use his radio effectively, communicated with the escort fighters through hand signals. They flew alongside, close enough to see into the cockpit, and Bragg gestured to indicate his intentions. He was going to try to land the aircraft. The P-51 pilots relayed this information to base command, adding their own assessment. Prepare rescue boats because this bomber was going into the water. But Bragg had no intention of ditching if he could avoid it. Ditching a B-17 in the Mediterranean was dangerous under the best circumstances. With the aircraft as damaged as it was, a water landing would almost certainly break the fuselage apart completely. The crew's best chance was a wheels-down landing on solid ground. So Bragg kept flying, nursed the damaged bomber along mile after agonizing mile, making constant small adjustments to keep it in the air. The physics of what was happening are worth considering. The B-17 was designed with incredible structural redundancy. Boeing's engineers had built strength into every element of the airframe, but this redundancy had limits, and All-American had exceeded them. The aerodynamic forces on the tail section were enormous. Wind flowing over and under the aircraft at 300 miles per hour created lift and drag forces that pulled and pushed in every direction. The damaged connection between the tail and the main fuselage had to withstand these forces, while also dealing with the torque created by control surface movements. It's a testament to both Boeing's engineering and to the crew's skill that the aircraft held together at all. 2.5 hours after the collision, All American approached its base near Biskra. 2.5 hours of flight time that must have felt like days. 2.5 hours of constant stress, constant alertness, constant awareness that the next second might be the one when the tail finally broke free. The base had been alerted. Emergency crews stood ready. Medical personnel waited. Everyone expected casualties, expected wounded men who would need immediate treatment. Bragg lined up for the final approach. This was the most critical phase. During landing, the aircraft's attitude changes constantly. The pilot pulls back on the controls to flare the aircraft, raising the nose and settling the tail. But with All American's damaged structure, any abrupt control input could cause catastrophic failure. Bragg had to land the bomber while barely touching the controls, using minimal elevator movement, letting the aircraft descend in a controlled glide rather than a standard approach. The wheels touched down. The aircraft bounced slightly, then settled. It rolled down the runway, slowing gradually, and then it stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. The engines idled. The propellers spun. Inside the aircraft, the crew sat in stunned silence, perhaps not quite believing they'd actually made it. Then they began to move, unbuckling harnesses, gathering equipment, preparing to exit. Here's where the full extent of the damage became visible to everyone watching. As the crew climbed out through the waist section and the tail gunner descended on a hastily positioned ladder, the structural stress that had been holding the tail section in place finally released. With no one inside to provide weight and stability, and with the aircraft no longer in motion, the tail section crumpled to the ground. It had held together just long enough. Minutes earlier, and the collapse would have happened while they were still in the air. Minutes later, and, well, there was no later. They'd made it. An ambulance rolled up beside the aircraft, medics ready to treat wounded crew members. Lieutenant Bragg waved them off. Not one member of the crew had been injured. Not one. They'd survived a mid-air collision with an enemy fighter, flown for 2.5 hours in an aircraft that should have broken apart, and landed safely without a scratch on any of them. The photographs taken after the landing show crew members standing beside the damaged bomber, looking up at the catastrophic damage, their faces showing a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and perhaps a touch of disbelief. The photographs also show something else, the remarkable nature of B-17 construction. Even with the fuselage nearly severed, even with control surfaces missing, even with massive holes in the structure, the underlying strength of the airframe was sufficient to keep the aircraft airborne. This was precisely what Boeing's engineers had designed for, though even they probably wouldn't have believed their creation could survive this level of damage. What happened to All American after that historic flight? The bomber was repaired and returned to service, though not without significant modifications. The damage was too extensive to fully restore the aircraft to original specifications. As a result, All American's flight characteristics were never quite right. It was reassigned to utility duties, ferrying supplies and personnel, rather than flying combat missions. It continued in this role for almost 2 years, finally being salvaged overseas in March 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. The crew, meanwhile, became something of a sensation. Their story was widely reported in military publications and newspapers back home. The photograph of All American, with its nearly severed fuselage, became one of the most famous images of World War II, a visual representation of both the punishment the B-17 could withstand and the skill of the crews who flew them. Lieutenant Bragg and his men had proven something important. With enough determination, skill, and perhaps a bit of luck, even impossible situations could be overcome. But it's crucial to understand that All American survival wasn't just about one crew and one aircraft. It was part of a larger pattern that emerged throughout the air. War. The B-17 Flying Fortress developed a reputation for bringing crews home under conditions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds of stories of B-17s landing with catastrophic damage, aircraft with entire sections of wing missing, bombers with engines shot away, B-17s that made it back to England with half the tail gone, with the nose shattered, with holes large enough to climb through in the fuselage. One particularly famous incident involved a B-17 named Ye Old Pub, piloted by Charlie Brown. On December 20th, 1943, Brown's bomber was shot to pieces by German fighters over Bremen. The tail gunner was killed. Several crew members were wounded. The nose cone was missing. 3 of the 4 engines were damaged. The aircraft was barely controllable. As they limped toward home at low altitude, a German Bf 109 fighter pulled alongside. The German pilot, Franz Stigler, was in position to deliver the killing blow, but instead he made an I-190's extraordinary decision. He flew escort with the damaged bomber, protecting it from German flak batteries until it reached the North Sea. Stigler's act of mercy saved Brown's crew, and 50 years later, the 2 pilots reunited and became friends. That story, too, became legend. Or consider the statistics on B-17 losses and survival. More than 4,700 B-17s were lost to accidents and enemy action during the war, a loss rate exceeding 37% of all aircraft built. But here's the remarkable thing. Many of those losses weren't instant. Many of those aircraft stayed airborne long enough for crews to bail out or attempt emergency landings. The B-17's ability to absorb damage translated directly into saved lives. Crews who might have died in other aircraft types made it home in their flying fortresses. The survival statistics for bomber crews paint a sobering picture of the air war's brutality. By the end of 1943, only 25% of 8th Air's force personnel had survived their 25 mission tours. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. Think about what that means. Every time a crew climbed into their bomber, they knew they had a 3 in 4 chance of not making it through their tour. Every mission was essentially a roll of the dice, and yet they kept flying, mission after mission, because the strategic bombing campaign was essential to winning the war. The bomber offensive against Germany was controversial then and remains so today. The cost in lives and aircraft was staggering. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Civilians died by the hundreds of thousands, but the impact on Germany's ability to wage war was undeniable. German industry was disrupted. Oil refineries, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's war machine, were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Fighter aircraft production was targeted, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse its factories, reducing efficiency. Transportation networks were shattered, making it difficult to move troops and supplies. The men who flew these missions didn't think in terms of grand strategy. They thought about surviving the next mission, about getting their crew home safely, about doing their jobs under conditions of extraordinary stress and danger. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who found themselves in command of multi-ton aircraft costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, carrying bombs that could level city blocks, facing enemy fighters and flak batteries determined to shoot them down. The training they received was intensive, but often insufficient for the reality they faced. Pilots learned to fly the B-17, learned formation flying, learned bombing procedures. Gunners learned to operate their weapons, to lead targets, to conserve ammunition. But no amount of training could fully prepare them for what it felt like to sit in a freezing aircraft while flak exploded around them, or to watch a bomber next to them in formation break apart after a direct hit, or to see German fighters diving through the formation with their cannons blazing. They learned quickly, or they didn't survive. The veterans who made it through their first few missions developed an almost sixth sense about danger. They could read the sky, anticipate when fighters might attack, recognize the black puffs of flak before others saw them. They learned which procedures worked and which were military bureaucracy that could be safely ignored in combat. And they learned to trust their crew, because survival depended on every man doing his job perfectly, every time. The crew of All-American exemplified this. When the collision happened, they didn't panic. They assessed the situation, made decisions based on their training and experience, and executed their plan. Lieutenant Bragg flew the aircraft with extraordinary skill. The co-pilot supported him. The gunners maintained vigilance against fighter attacks. The navigator ensured they stayed on course. Every man contributed to their survival. It's worth noting that their survival was also enabled by factors beyond their direct control. The combat box formation meant they had the protection of other bombers' guns. The P-51 escorts added an additional layer of defense. The relatively short distance from target to base, 300 miles versus the 1,000-mile missions flown from England into Germany, meant they didn't have to keep the damaged bomber airborne as long as they would have on a deep penetration mission. If the collision had happened farther from base, or if German fighters had pressed their attacks, the outcome might have been very different. But none of that diminishes their achievement. They were dealt an impossible situation, and they overcame it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They proved that human beings, when properly trained and motivated, can accomplish things that seem to violate the laws of physics and probability. They added another chapter to the legend of the B-17 Flying Fortress, an aircraft that has become synonymous with American air power in World War II. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain in flying condition. These aircraft are treasured historical artifacts, maintained by dedicated volunteers and organizations. When they fly at air shows, they draw enormous crowds. People want to see these legendary bombers, want to hear the sound of those four radial engines, want to connect with a piece of history that seems increasingly remote as the veterans who flew them pass away. The All-American itself didn't survive to become part of this flying heritage. Scrapped in Italy in 1945, it exists now only in photographs and in the memories preserved through military records and crew accounts. But those photographs remain powerful. Look at them today, and it's still shocking to see an aircraft so badly damaged that somehow continued to fly. The visual evidence contradicts what our brains tell us is possible. An aircraft with its fuselage nearly cut in half should not remain airborne, and yet it did. The lessons from All-American's flight extend beyond aviation history. They speak to broader themes of resilience, of finding solutions under extreme pressure, of refusing to accept that a situation is hopeless until every option has been exhausted. Lieutenant Bragg could have ordered his crew to bail out. He would have been entirely justified in doing so. The aircraft was catastrophically damaged. Standard procedure called for abandoning ship. But he made a different choice, and that choice saved his entire crew from becoming prisoners of war or casualties. The story also highlights the importance of engineering excellence. Boeing's designers built remarkable strength into the B-17. They created redundant load paths, used robust structural members, employed design principles that maximize survivability. Their work paid off thousands of times during the war as damaged B-17Cs limped home when lesser aircraft would have broken apart. The All-American incident stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of this engineering triumph, but it was far from the only one. For the veterans who flew B-17s, stories like All-Americans weren't surprising. They'd seen too much, experienced too much, to be shocked by what the Flying Fortress could endure. They knew crews who'd brought damaged bombers home against impossible odds. They knew aircraft that had been written off as total losses, but somehow made it back to base. These experiences created a bond between crews and their aircraft that went beyond simple appreciation. The B-17 saved their lives, repeatedly, and they never forgot it. As the decades have passed and the number of surviving World War II veterans has dwindled, the importance of preserving these stories has become increasingly clear. Each veteran who passes takes with them memories and experiences that can never be fully replicated through historical research. The fear they felt over target areas, the camaraderie they shared with their crews, the pride they took in doing their jobs under conditions most of us can barely imagine, the relief they experienced every time they landed safely after a mission. These things can be described, but they can't truly be conveyed to those who weren't there. That's why historical preservation matters. That's why the surviving B-17s are so important. That's why we tell these stories, passing them down from generation to generation, not to glorify war. There's nothing glorious about young men dying in burning aircraft or freezing to death in damaged bombers, but to remember the courage, the sacrifice, the extraordinary things ordinary people accomplished when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The crew of All-American were ordinary men. They came from towns and cities across America. They had families, dreams, plans for after the war. The war interrupted those plans, thrust them into situations they never imagined they'd face, asked them to risk their lives repeatedly for a cause larger than themselves. And they did it. They climbed into their bomber's mission after mission, knowing the odds, knowing the dangers, and they flew anyway. On February 1st, 1943, they faced a test that would have defeated most people. A mid-air collision that nearly destroyed their aircraft. Catastrophic damage that should have made continued flight impossible. A long journey back to base with the aircraft threatening to break apart at any moment. They passed that test not through superhuman abilities or divine intervention, but through training, skill, teamwork, and determination. They proved that in the crucible of combat, human beings are capable of remarkable things. That's the real story of the All-American. Not just an aircraft that defied the odds, but a crew that refused to accept defeat. Not just a famous photograph, but a testament to what properly trained and motivated people can accomplish. Not just a historical curiosity, but a reminder that when faced with impossible situations, the only reasonable response is to do the impossible. As you go about your day, take a moment to consider what these men experienced. Consider what it would be like to fly in a damaged aircraft, knowing that at any moment it could break apart. Consider the trust they had to place in each other, the way each crew member's life depended on the others doing their jobs perfectly. Consider the courage it took to stay with that aircraft rather than bail out. And consider that there were thousands of other crews, tens of thousands of other missions, countless other examples of extraordinary courage in the face of terrible danger. The World War II generation has been called the greatest generation, and stories like All Americans help explain why. These weren't people who sought glory or fame. They were ordinary Americans who, when their country needed them, stepped forward and did what had to be done. They flew the missions, dropped the bombs, fought the battles that eventually led to victory. And then, when the war ended, they came home and built the modern world, rarely talking about what they'd experienced, rarely seeking recognition for what they'd accomplished. If you found this story compelling, if you learned something new about the air war over Europe and North Africa, consider subscribing to this channel for more World War II history. Hit that like button to help others discover these stories. Share this video with anyone interested in aviation history, military history, or simply incredible tales of human resilience. These stories matter. These veterans matter. And as long as we continue to tell their stories, to preserve their memories, to honor their sacrifice, they'll never truly be gone. The crew of All American flew home against impossible odds on February 1st, 1943. Their achievement deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and passed down to future generations. That's how we honor them. That's how we ensure that what they did, what they risked, what they survived, continues to inspire us decades later. Thank you for watching, and remember, when someone tells you something is impossible, think about Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg and his crew flying a B-17 with its fuselage nearly severed in half. Then go out and prove them wrong.